Good morning, everyone. May I ask if I am audible?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you for having me this morning. Happy to be here.
Coba yang
Good morning, Dr. Ryan.
Good morning. Good morning. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
good morning. Nice to meet you, Ryan.
Good morning. Good morning, sir. Yes.
Okay, can we start then?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Visiting Professor on Ecocriticism, Nature and Poetry. My name is Adinda Aya Zahra, and I am honored to serve as your Master of Ceremony for today's event. On behalf of the committee, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all participants, our distinguished speaker, and the honorable officials joining us today. Allow me mention our special guest, Ibu Eta Farmaselia Nurul Hadi, PhD Vice Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Diponegoro, Dr. Andes Aktiva Heri Chandra M. Hum, Head of the English Literature Study Program, Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Diponegoro, John Charles Ryan, PhD from Southern Cross University, and Mem Solistia Dingtias, SSMA, our moderator from Universitas Diponegoro. Thank you for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to read out today's agenda briefly. We will begin with the opening prayer and the national anthem. Next, we will have remarks from the Vice Dean, Professor Eta Farmaselia Nurul Hadi, PhD. After that, we will proceed with a group photo session. And then following this, the presentation and Q&A session with our speaker, John Charles Ryan, PhD, will be guided by Mem Sulistianing Tias, SSMA, as our moderator. After these inspiring talks, finally, we will conclude with remarks from the head of the English Literature Study Program, Dr. Andes Aktiva Heri Chandra M. Hum, to officially end today's session. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed, I would like to kindly remind all participants to stay in the Zoom meeting until the end of the event, as there will be an attendance form to fill out for the certification of participation. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin the main session, let us take a moment to pray for the smooth runnings of today's event. Please pray according to your faith and belief. Okay, the prayers has ended. Thank you. To begin our event, I kindly invite everyone to join in the singing of Indonesian national anthem, Indonesia Raya. Thank you. Now we respectfully invite the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Ma'am Etta Farmacelia Nurul Hadi, PhD, to deliver the opening remarks and officially open the event. Ma'am Etta, over to you now.
Yeah, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It's a great honor for us today at English Department, Faculty of Humanities, Diponegoro University, University Diponegoro, to have Professor John Charles Ryan from Southern Cross University to share the knowledge about ecocriticism. So we all know how environment is important to us, and that ecocriticism, the study of relationship between nature and literature, helps us to appreciate not only literature but also nature better, because we need to live side by side with nature, and we live to protect our environment. And today is the right time for us to learn more from Professor John Charles Ryan from Southern Cross University to know more about poetry. So let's just enjoy poetry, that we can enjoy poetry, but also we can learn more on how to appreciate nature to understanding poetry better. So again, thank you for that of the English department, Dr. Aktiva Heri Chandra, for organizing this event, and also other lecturers who have worked hard with the team to make this event, the visiting professor, happen this morning. On the behalf of the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, let's start this event together and let's learn together from Professor John Charles Ryan. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you so much for the talks, Ma'am Etta. Before we move on to the main session, let us capture this precious moment with a group photo. We kindly ask all participants to turn on their cameras. Okay, let's take the picture. Okay, thank you. We now move on to the keynote session, which will consist of presentation followed by a question and answer segment. To guide this session, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Ma'am Sulistianing Tias, SSMA, is a lecturer at Universitas Diponegoro, specializing in English literature with academic degrees from Universitas Brawijaya and Universitas Gadjah Mada. Her research focuses on literary and cultural studies with publications on themes such as trauma, identity politics, and environmental consciousness in literature. Now it's time to hand over to our moderator. Ma'am Tias, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Adin, for the kind introduction. And good morning, everyone. I am Tias from Universitas Diponegoro, and I am truly delighted to serve as your moderator for today's session. And it's such an honor to welcome all of you to our visiting professor lecture titled Ecocriticism, Nature and Poetry. And today we are privileged to have with us Dr. John Charles Ryan, an esteemed scholar and writer whose works explore the deep connections between literature, ecology, and the environment. And now allow me to briefly share Dr. Ryan's academic and professional background. Well, I must say, when I first read Dr. Ryan's CV, it was quite a long list, truly impressive. And I will do my best to highlight the key points only, everyone. Okay, so Dr. John Charles Ryan is an associate professor of creative writing at Royal Phimso College in Busan, an adjunct senior research fellow at the University of Notre Dame in Australia, and a visiting researcher at the Arctic Center, University of Lapland, Finland. He is a writer, critic, and leading scholar in the environmental humanities, specializing in ecopoetics, transdisciplinary plant studies, and literature. And Dr. Ryan has authored and edited an extensive range of academic books and published hundreds of scholarly works, including journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers. And his research has gained international recognition and has been supported by various competitive grants. And his current project, Gifts from the Sentient Forest, is funded by the Kony Foundation in Finland. With extensive teaching and research experience across Asia, Europe, and Australia, Dr. Ryan continued to bridge literature, ecology, and creativity in inspiring ways. So, for those who would like to learn more about Dr. Ryan's work, you may visit his personal website at www.johncharlesryan.com. And there you can find his published books, academic articles with direct links, and information about his current research project. And I think it reflects not only his productivity as a scholar and writer, but also his deep passion for literature, nature, and the environment. Okay, so everyone, before we begin, let me remind you that you're welcome to share your thoughts or questions during the Q&A sessions later. And also, please feel free to write in the chat box if Dr. Ryan gives specific instructions or asks for your responses during the session. Okay, now without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. John Charles Ryan to deliver his presentation. Yeah, over to you, Dr. Ryan.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the university for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. If there's any distortion in my audio, just let me know, and I will switch over to a different network. Okay, can I just check again that my audio and my visual are both working?
Yes, it's perfect, Dr. Ryan.
Okay, very good. So I speak to you this morning from Bhutan, and Bhutan is a very mountainous country. So occasionally the networks have some difficulties traversing the mountains. So just let me know if there's any issues as I progress. So I'm very happy to join you this morning for Ecocriticism, Nature, and Poetry. And what this represents is, as I've mentioned in the subtitle, a flowering of environmental consciousness in academia. What ecocriticism does is it gives us a framework for studying the environment within an academic context. So we can approach literature, but we can also approach other works, including pop cultural works and media works from an environmental perspective. Okay, and it's such an incredibly important issue in today's world, where, as we know, the environment is compromised in many ways, and sustainability is a priority of many nations. Let's begin with ecocriticism. Ecocriticism has much to do with language, the words that we use to describe the world around us, which for some is nature, right? So we have in both English and Bahasa words like nature, environment, landscape, ecology, earth, plants, natural world, and in Bahasa Indonesian alam, lingkungan, lanskap, ekologi, bumi, tanaman, dunia alami. Each one signifies something different, something just slightly different. When we think of nature in the English language, it's very much a philosophical term. It's philosophical insofar as it includes all living and non-living parts of the environment. Um, so it includes plants, animals, water, soil, and air. But there's also a connotation that has to do with the essence of things. What's the nature of reality? What's the nature of human being, right? And so nature is a philosophical idea. Nature is a very broadly encompassing term and perhaps one of the most complex terms in the English language, along with the term culture. So that's nature. When we think of environment, we think of the physical surroundings of an organism. The most essential aspect to understanding the term environment. So we can refer to our local environment. We could even refer to our domestic environment, the environment of our backyard, the environment of our neighborhood. But there's also the regional environment, right? And then there's the planetary environment. So the scales of these kind of scales, from the very local to the planetary, are essential to understanding environment. But once again, it refers mostly to the physical surroundings of an organism. There are all sorts of issues, conceptual and ethical issues around the term environment, right? Is the environment an externalized reality? For example, do we have to go to a national park down the road in order to experience the environment, right? So something to consider. Landscape really comes from the history of art and aesthetics. So landscape tends to refer to a natural and cultural environment that humans have transformed, often resulting in scenic views. So you can imagine a parkland that's been created out of a forest to enhance scenic views over a valley. And within that valley, there are some picturesque kind of villages and so forth. That is very much a landscape. And the term actually comes from a Dutch term referring to a kind of created environment, much like a painter would create a beautiful, picturesque portrait over an environment, a sweeping view. So landscape reinforces that kind of emphasis on the visual prospect and the beauty of the outlook. So landscape very much coming from art history and aesthetics. Ecology very much derives from science. If you've ever taken a course in biology or environmental studies, you would have come across this term ecology, which derives from the Greek term for household. Ecology is a branch of biology exploring the relationships between organisms. It's become popularized in the sense that ecology now refers to deep interrelationality. So we have terms like an ecology of media, ecology of industrial relations and factors, right? So it's a metaphor for deep interrelationality, but it stems from the biological sciences to refer to those relationships. And then we have the Earth. Earth is the planet we inhabit, also sometimes called the biosphere, but we can also refer to the soil beneath our feet as Earth. The ground is Earth. So the Earth is both planet, but it's also the tangible reality under our feet. Okay, and of course, the soil is a complex ecosystem in itself. Here is our Earth, and we must realize that this is a relatively new consciousness that we have of our planet. This image is actually only from 1972. It's called Blue Marble. And this was taken by the crew of Apollo 17 during their historic mission. And so that's about, 53 years old, 53 years where we've had this perception of our planet as this both fragile, beautiful, and enduring living ecosystem, living home, traversing the cosmos. It's probably one of the most profound moments in human consciousness, in the history of human consciousness, is this image of our Earth. And so this has been very influential to the environmental movement. over the last 50 plus years, this image of our planet that we inhabit, our home, floating in the deepness of space. So I'd like to ask you, do you have a favorite place on Earth? Do you have a favorite place in nature? Why is that place meaningful for you? So just spend a minute writing some of your responses in the chat. What is your favorite place in nature? Why is that place meaningful to you? Just take a little time to reflect on that and enter your brief comments in the chat just for a moment. And as you're contemplating that, I'll just give you an announcement here. This is a book that covers a lot of these ideas, the introduction to the environmental humanities. I've attached that as a PDF in the chat, so you're welcome to download that book and to use it as you like. It covers not only eco-criticism, but the broader field of the environmental humanities. All right, so yeah, I look forward to seeing your responses. I'll have a look after the after my talk here towards the end, and I look forward to learning about the places that you cherish. The places on Earth. Every person needs a place, right? We need our home. That's our home. That's our home. So the environmental humanities is the broadest structure for environmental scholarship, interdisciplinary environmental scholarship. And eco-criticism is an essential part of the environmental humanities. But the environmental humanities is much broader than eco-criticism in itself. The environmental humanities is the interdisciplinary exploration of the environment and various humanistic areas. So to study, for example, the study of art and environment, the study of music, philosophy, and environment, the study of history and the environment, theology and spirituality and the environment. These all fall within the scope of the environmental humanities. So the environmental humanities focuses on, firstly, the environment as a phenomenon, as something that human beings can interact with and experience through our senses, through our memory, through our emotions. Secondly, the environmental humanities studies ecological issues like climate change, like the clearance of land for crop production, like the loss of species, the loss of biodiversity, air and water pollution, and so forth. Also, microplastics, a very, very huge issue around the world today. And then lastly, the environmental humanities studies human-nature interactions. So if we think, for example, of the traditional relationships between an indigenous society and their local plant life, use of plants as medicines, as totems, as food, as fibers, as ornamentation, and so forth, that fits within the environmental humanities. It's the study of a human-nature interaction over time. The environmental humanities is the study of environmental ideas, and I've already mentioned these terms as far as where each one comes from. Ecology from science, environment very much from the study of geography and understanding the scales according to which places occur, from the very local to the planetary. Landscape coming from the history of art and aesthetics, nature really being a philosophical precept. There's another one that you'll often come across, and it's the non-human. The non-human. Non-human refers to both an organism, a living being, but also a machine. And this is an especially important term as AI starts to take great hold within our societies across the world, where now we don't even have, say, a robotic machine. We have a program, an AI, they call it. It's highly intangible, but that's a non-human presence. So the term non-human comes very much from an area of philosophy called post-humanism. Post-humanism. Okay, so just some of the terms that we use. These kinds of environment, nature, human relationships are evident in the earliest works of art of Western civilization. This is a cave painting at Lascaux Cave in France, dating to about 17,000 years ago. And you can see there are some cattle-like creatures that are in fact extinct, but are represented on the walls of this cave. So people back 17,000 years ago were honoring these cattle-like creatures. They're in fact they're called aurochs, I believe, A-U-R-O-C-H, A-U-R-O-C-H-S, aurochs. So the people depended on the aurochs for their existence, for food and for materials and so forth. There were probably also spiritual entities. And so painting them on the walls of the cave was a way to give respect, honor, and ensure the auroch would continue to provide for their culture. In the history of environmental humanities in Asia and to the East, there's a rich and long tradition of environment human interactions. And if we look at some of the artworks from Asian cultures, we see lots of human environment interconnections. So many it's hard to count. This is a painting from 1657 by an artist named Wang Jian in the Chinese tradition of landscape painting, or shan shui, referring to mountains and water. And we can see how the mountain scene kind of envelops the human presence. There are huts and at the bottom of this ravine, and this the mountain landscape very much engulfs the human landscape, suggesting the power and sublimity of the mountain environment. Now we can also apply this framework of environmental humanities to other artworks. This is 1869 Japanese painting, and we can examine, for example, how the cedar trees surround the shrine. The cedar trees being associated with sacred places, so they would be planted alongside shrines as forms of protection. And we also find a connection with the river, with the water. So we have a water element, the trees, the earth element, the mountains, and the shrines. So there's an integration between these different elements as shown in the painting. All right, so what we're doing actually in the environmental humanities and ecocriticism is known as cross-disciplinary research. There are a few terms that you'll encounter if you go further into these fields, and I'd like to just briefly present 4 of them. The first is cross-disciplinary, the second is multidisciplinary, the third is interdisciplinary, and the fourth is transdisciplinary. They're slightly different. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but actually they are just slightly different. When you're performing cross-disciplinary research, you're trying to view a discipline from the perspective of another discipline. So let's say you want to understand biology through the discipline of history or the discipline of philosophy. Okay. And conversely, let's say you'd like to understand literature, but through the discipline of ecology, which is scientific. So you want to understand how literature represents those ecological relationships. Now, multidisciplinary means that you're working together on a project. Let's say you have various disciplines working towards a common goal. Let's say you have someone in legal studies on your team, and then you have a literary expert, you have a scientist, you have a sociologist. So that's a multidisciplinary research team. When you perform interdisciplinary research, there's a certain blending of knowledge that occurs. Let's say you'll have that same research project, but there's greater integration between the disciplines, right? So it's not so much, let's say, it could be the case that the sociologist on the team is really engaging with the sociology of biology. And so what starts to happen is there's a greater integration of disciplines. Now, this is all very slight. The differences are very slight. The highest level of this is called transdisciplinarity. That means that you're focusing on the production of knowledge, and the actual discipline that you're part of seems to vanish, right? So So the difference, the shades of difference between each of these is a little bit vague sometimes, but the highest level of collaboration between disciplines is transdisciplinarity. That's when your research goal goes beyond the individual disciplines that you align with, right? And the research aims become therefore transdisciplinary. A project, for example, like health, environment, and let's see, climate change, health, environment, and climate change, that could have a transdisciplinary focus if it were to not restrict itself to any particular disciplinary way of doing things, whether it's research design or theoretical frameworks, right? So just bear in mind that these terms are slightly different, but transdisciplinarity is the highest form of partnership and collaboration. Here's a schemata that kind of represents this. You could see multidisciplinarity, where the disciplines are conversing, but not necessarily integrating. Interdisciplinarity, when the knowledge starts to overlap, but there's still great areas where we retain the disciplinary knowledge of each, right? And then in this transdisciplinary, that knowledge begins to blend. The methods begin to blend, the theoretical frameworks begin to blend. And this is where innovation often emerges. Innovation often emerges out of transdisciplinary research. Okay, so this transdisciplinary environmental studies have a lot to do with relationality. And there are many metaphors for relationality. One of which is this, it's the rhetorical question, can a butterfly in Brazil really cause a tornado in Texas? In other words, can an impact at a microscopic level cause an effect at a macroscopic level, right? And remember, we discussed environment. Essential to understanding the term environment is the scale of various environments, from the very local to the regional to the global, even the cosmic, right? So this is, again, a question about scale. It's rhetorical insofar as it's not meant to have an answer. It's meant to get us thinking about the deep interrelationality of our world. Can a butterfly's flutter of wings in Brazil trigger a tornado in Texas, right? So let me just carry quickly through these slides. Some of the focus of the environmental humanities is on endangered species, and we find endangered species in many works of literature. This in particular is the vaquita. It's a critically endangered porpoise of the northern areas of the Gulf of California. It's known as the world's rarest marine mammal. So the environmental humanities is very concerned with endangered species, and also literature tends to deal with endangered species and giving them a story, giving those species a voice as they are endangered by a multitude of factors. We know that climate change, and I'll just pace through these quickly, climate change is a major issue that the environmental humanities deals with. There's an entire area of literature called cli-fi, climate fiction, but there's also climate poetry, there's climate nonfiction, there's climate drama. All forms of literature nowadays have begun to address the climate crisis. Okay, and this is a schemata of the of the Earth's history, basically indicating that the human presence on the planet is a very recent phenomenon, but the impacts have been beyond comparison in the history of the Earth. And that's why there's been a push to rename our present era the Anthropocene, the era of the human, the era dominated by the human. So a lot of the environmental humanities is about trying to see the world differently. So have a look at this image. What do you see? What do you see in this image? There are at least two choices. There may be more, in fact. Some of us will see one thing, some of us will see the other, right? This is called the duck rabbit paradox. So if you saw a rabbit initially, try to then see the duck. If you saw the duck initially, try to refocus your eyes and see the rabbit. This is called the duck-rabbit visual paradox. And what this suggests to us is that we need to be able to see these issues differently, issues of climate change and species loss, in order to come up with new solutions that could be effective to dealing with them. So training our perception, and that's what the environmental humanities does, often through art, art as an intervention to expressing, in this case, the loss of species. In this work of art called Spider Woman's Hands from 2007, right? The list of species on the back of the screen there, and then all the hands. And then also looking to some models in the world regarding sustainability. This is Singapore. This is the futuristic gardens of Singapore. Singapore being an example of some sustainability options that have been successful with a high population and urban environment, integrating gardens and so forth in a highly urban environment. Not 100% effective, but certainly something to think about. All right. So so far, what we've addressed is a broad range of environment-human relationships. And what I want to assert here is that language is essential. Language is essential to understanding human nature relationships. And language is a very crucial component of the environmental humanities. And it's really an eco-criticism where we find a deep exploration of language and its relationship to nature, and how we often construct those relationships to nature through language, right? So how we, for example, determine that something is an environment, something is nature as compared to culture, shows a lot about the cultural values we have, our histories, our philosophies, and so forth. So language and climate change are connected in a multitude of ways, not only insofar as the language we use to express the urgencies of climate change, but also the real danger that many languages face as climate change accelerates. So as this heading says, while we're losing biological diversity, we're also losing linguistic and cultural diversity. As climate change impacts places, it also threatens the languages of those places, as well as the human communities and the non-human communities. This study from Nature suggesting that ecological drivers of variation in global language diversity, so that there are ecological factors that drive that variation and have driven the variation. And then as those ecological factors disappear, so too does the diversity of language. The language environment, extremely important. Okay, so eco-criticism is most optimally understood within the context of the environmental humanities. Consider the environmental humanities like an umbrella term. And within the environmental humanities, you have the study of human nature and, let's say, religion, human nature and history, humans' nature and language and literature. And that's where eco-criticism comes to the fore. Eco-criticism deals with environmental texts. This is a term that comes from a book called The Environmental Imagination from 1995 by Lawrence Buell. And in this book, he defined an environmental text as any text. So it could be a novel, but also a website is a text, a television program, an article, an advertisement, and even in some studies, graffiti. Graffiti is a text, right? So there are a multitude of texts. Any text that represents the environment, ecological issues, and or human-land relations. Now, some texts will be more overt in their treatment of the environment. But I would argue that any text can be examined from an eco-critical perspective. If the text is about a highly urbanized environment, or let's say a highly urbanized location where there's no bird life, there's no animals, there seems to be no plants, there seems to be no trees, that text can still be studied from an eco-critical perspective, because what is left out of the text is often as important as what is represented in the text. Okay, so that's the idea of the environmental text as a text in which, quote, the non-human environment is present not merely as a framing device, but as a presence. So Buell definitely had in mind that there are literary works that are more properly eco-critical. I would suggest that all literary works are eco-critical insofar as what they leave out often suggests something as crucial as what they keep in, what they represent, what they depict. Okay, so let's say a text is about, let's say a text deals with someone's home environment, right? The characters never leave that home. There's ecology still at work in that home environment, right? From the food in the refrigerator to the food on the table to the microorganisms in the walls or whatever it may be. Ecology is inescapable. Therefore, any text can be approached from an eco-critical perspective. All right, so eco-criticism is the study, literary and historical analysis of environmental text. All right, the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment, demonstrating an earth-centered approach to literary studies. So this is a little different to what I'm arguing. These early eco-critics definitely had a canon in mind, so works that are explicitly environmental. Let's say like the works of Henry David Thoreau, Annie Dillard, Richard Powers more recently, and certainly lots of Indonesian authors have developed Karani Baroka, for example, in poetry, Indonesian poetry. Some of those texts are explicitly eco-critical, explicitly environmental. But once again, I'd argue that you can apply an eco-critical perspective to any text. Eco-criticism has diversified greatly in the past 30 years since Buell and others were writing. Now we have strands of eco-criticism that focus on affective states or emotions, right? Eco-criticism of plants, which is an area that I specialized in. Eco-criticism in animals, so zoo criticism, water, right, hydrocriticism, also empirical approaches to eco-criticism, so using data in studies of literary work, right, doing surveys or doing different quantitative analyses of a literary work's impact. That's called empirical eco-criticism. As I mentioned, eco-criticism has diversified, and an important area of study is animals in literature. Animal texts are those representing animal life and human-animal relations. You could think of lots of works in the Western literary canon that deal with animals, that deal with birds, deal with fauna, macrofauna like elephants, and even domestic animals, cats, and like John Steinbeck's My Travels with Charlie with his dog. You could approach that from an animal and literature perspective. And the term for this within eco-criticism is zoo criticism, as the reading of literary text through an animal-focused lens. What does that text tell us about human relationships to domestic animals, to wild animals, to endangered animals, right? To animals that are less charismatic than, let's say, elephants and tigers and zebras, right? The animals that, for whatever reason, don't get the fanfare of other animals. And this area of zoo criticism comes from a number of strands historically, one of which is post-colonial eco-criticism. So post-colonial eco-criticism is the study of the impact of post-colonialism on literary works and their depictions of the environment. Okay, very important for countries like Australia, Indonesia, India, also post-colonial eco-criticism, the study of environment, essentially the relationship between colonialism environment, and literature. But not only colonialism, post-colonialism, and neo-colonialism. So environments that are still being impacted by colonial factors after the colonial power has evacuated, has gone elsewhere, and independence has been achieved by the country. So that's neo-colonialism. Plants and literature is an area that I focus on. We can talk about plant texts as those that represent plant life and human flora relations. Now, those plants need to be wild plants. They can be domestic plants. They can be plants in a bedroom, potted plants, home plants in the home. And of course, there's a connection here as well with food, right? Plants that are part of our diets. Of course, we can't survive without plants in our diet. So plant text and phytocriticism as the reading of these texts from a plant-attuned lens. So, for example, if we wanted to develop a phytocritical approach to Shakespeare, we might look at the use of flowers as symbols. We might look at food plants in Shakespeare, medicinal plants in Shakespeare, and so forth. That's phytocritical approach. And then this emerges from a broader field within the environmental humanities called human plant studies. Human plant studies oftentimes is connected to the study of ethics in plants. So do plants feel pain? Do trees suffer? Do plants have feelings? Do plants sense the world? Do plants have memory? If they have memory, if a forest has memory, what does that mean ethically for human beings? Are we under an ethical charge to not only preserve that forest as a living environment, but as an archive, if you will, as an environment with deep historical meaning? If forests have memory. If you've ever looked at a tree that's been cut, there are tree rings. And those tree rings are like records. They're like an archive, because in those tree rings, you can see perturbations when certain environmental catastrophes came through: tornadoes, hurricanes, infestations of insects, and so forth. So the tree rings are like an archive of time. They're an archive of that forest's history. So that's what we mean by forests as having memory. Okay, so take a moment, just a minute. What's your favorite plant? Okay, what is your favorite plant? Why does that plant have meaning for you? And just write your response in the chat. And we'll just take a quick breather. So what is your favorite plant, and why does that plant have meaning? I look forward to reviewing your responses in the chat after my talk here. So continue to put some responses in the chat there. I'd like to suggest that one of my favorites is the banyan tree. When we think about nature, it's important to be as specific as possible. And this is what science teaches us. Nature is such a broad and abstract term, one of the most complex in the English language. What is it then we are referring to when we talk about nature? And that's why the study of plants can be so productive in the study of literature. So I would like to briefly go through a plant that I see as representing the power of nature. And also a species having the ability to galvanize, to inspire, and to become a part of the human communities within, or with whom it grows, right? So this is the banyan tree, an incredibly important tree in many ways for Indonesian culture. And this is a banyan that I counter. Here it is, the banyan, right? These are called aerial roots. These roots, they're growing down. They're growing down. And over time, these will grow into the ground, into the earth, and they will become like trunks. So this banyan will, over time, become like a forest. It will start to resemble a forest as these aerial roots grow down into the ground. A fascinating tree. So this is the banyan tree at Candi Mendut, the temple near Borobudur. And this is a banyan tree planted there, very historically important. Here are these beautiful aerial roots, right? And under the cover of the tree, we find people gathering, we find the family here, children playing, swinging from the aerial roots. And as you know, also offerings being made to the banyan tree. Here is an example of a small alcove made by the aerial roots of the tree. These aerial roots have become hardened. Now, it's important also to remember that the banyan tree begins its life as a seed, like every other plant, but as it grows, it's often deposited, the seed is deposited into another tree. And as the banyan tree grows, it starts to overtake this host tree. So it starts to sprout, it sends out its aerial roots, it starts to overtake or strangle. That's why it's called the strangler fig. It starts to strangle this host tree and then grow. So inside the banyan, you can often see the fossilized remains or sometimes just the impression of that original host tree. It's a fascinating growth habit. To understand this banyan, it's very important to understand its connection to the temple. And this is an ancient connection um, to the temple. The banyan planted there purposefully in connection with the Candi Mendut, but also Candi Mendut has a direct connection to the Borobudur complex. And so there's an axis connecting Candi Mendut, this old banyan tree, and Borobudur. So it's all intentionally orchestrated by the original architects. So, of course, the banyan is very significant in the spiritualities of Java, as we find within Candi Mendut, the Buddha and two bodhisattvas seated opposite one another. The banyan also occurs on these relief sculptures as well. There are multiple depictions of the banyan tree signifying its spiritual importance. And here it is again with the aerial roots. Saya di sini, I am here. This is known as Pohon Dewata, the tree of the gods, a tremendously large and impactful banyan. If you just stand under the banyan, you can feel the power of the non-human, right? It's very, very, very much present. Okay, outside of the complex, we have a typical scene. We have sellers selling jamu, right? Ginger, turmeric, and other herbal decoctions. So it's quite an interesting scene from a plant studies perspective, right? And of course, the connection with Mount Merapi as well. So I would recommend if you are studying nature to be as specific about it as you can. And that's what science teaches us to do, to specify our interests. So banyan for me is an embodiment of nature, right? And as we look closely at this tree, we find that it is so interconnected, not only with other life forms, but with history and spirituality. Beringen, right? Beringen, the banyan of Java, very, very important to many of the Javanese mythologies, incredibly significant in animist spiritualities, and also a familiar being, what we could call a companion species, a plant that lives with us in our day-to-day environments. It's not off in some wilderness area. It's right there with us in the middle of our history and culture and in the middle of our environments. So consider nature. And as you know, if you've been to Yogyakarta, there are the twin banyans, Waringin Kurung, And these banyans, as you know, if you navigate with the blindfold on and you navigate perfectly through the two banyans, it's auspicious. You will have good fortune. And here are two people doing just that and working their way through the two banyans with blindfolds on to test their fates, right? So banyans are ever present. There's a fascinating story of the banyans in Yogyakarta. There was a very massive one that toppled over in 1988. And this happened during the funerary rites of the ninth Sultan, who had passed away earlier during a visit to the United States. So the Sultan passed away, and the tree suddenly fell. And so there's the belief that there is this correspondence between, there was a correspondence between the trees and the Sultan, that the tree was expressing its grief and toppled over because of the death of the Sultan. So that's a local belief. Okay, right. So the banyan. What I'd like to do now, as I flip through these beautiful banyan trees, is just to take you through an exercise on writing poetry. Right. So banyan. Remember my message is if you're studying nature, the first thing to do is be as specific as possible. What nature are you studying? It could be an animal, it could be a sea lion environment. It could be Titan arum, one of the most amazing plants in the world, having the largest inflorescence or flower spike in the world, right? Very highly endangered, only growing in Sumatra, but also very, very popular in Western greenhouses, where some of these time-lapse videos of the Titan arum flowering have tens of millions of views. People are fascinated by the Titan arum flower. And Indonesia is the home of the Titan arum. Sumatra, Western Sumatra, is the only place in the world where the Titan arum grows naturally. So another plant we could focus on as embodying nature, right? Nature is such an abstract term. So we could examine the deep connections between local societies and the Titan arum. There's, for example, there's lots of lore around the Titan arum as having the power to swallow lost children, right? So oftentimes the parents will be careful not to expose the children to areas where there's Titan arum. So there's some recognition of the power of Titan arum among societies, but also a deep love for the flower, as we see here, as representing what is so incredibly special about Indonesian environments. Okay, so what is the nature? And yeah, which would you rather hug? Titan arum, a banyan tree, or a durian, right? If you had to hug one of the three. Great. Let us take a little bit of time now to look at poetry. And I'd like to get you writing some poetry as well. Right? And what we're going to write briefly here is called a persona poem. Persona poem. Now, in literature, the term persona refers to a character. Right? So in a play, in a novel, in a poem, in a short story, the persona voices a perspective, right? A persona. A persona poem uses a first person I to speak from the perspective of someone or something else. So that's a persona poem. What we're going to do is write a nature persona poem. So if a persona poem is one that uses the first person I to speak from the perspective of someone or something else, we can also combine that with a nature poem. A nature poem celebrates the beauty and wonder of the natural world, but more recently, nature poetry has started to turn towards environmental problems. So persona poem, nature poem. So what we're going to write, we can call a nature persona poem. A nature persona poem is one that's told from the perspective of an animal, of a plant, of a leaf, of a rock, from the water, from the perspective of the sky. So if your poem is spoken from the perspective of a plant or of an animal, it's a nature persona poem. All right, and there are examples of this throughout English literature, English poetry, poems that adopt the perspective of the non-human, whatever it may be, plant, animal, rock, leaf, water. Nature persona poem. In these poems, the writer tries to become nature. The writer tries to deeply empathize with that plant, that animal, with the water body, with the sky, with the rock, in order to speak on that behalf of that non-human being. So the writer tries to become nature. Here is an example of a nature persona poem. This is by a writer named Louise Gluck, and she wrote a volume of poetry called The Wild Iris in 1992. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And in this poem called The Wild Iris, Gluck is writing from the perspective of the wild iris. Wild iris is known for its beautiful flower, but it's a perennial, which means that it dies back, the foliage dies back, and then the bulb lives underground through the winter, doesn't reseed, right? So it just lives as a bulb, kind of in hibernation over the winter, and then it starts to grow again when the warm spring sun hits the soil. I'll just read a few lines, but this is an example of a nature persona poem, speaking from the perspective of the flower. At the end of my suffering, there was a door. Hear me out. That which you call death, I remember. Overhead, noises, branches of the pine shifting. Then nothing. The weak sun flickered over the dry surface. It is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth. Okay, so you can see there's a distinct voice in the poem, and that voice is the voice of the wild iris, surviving as it does over winter as a bulb buried in the earth. You can imagine this bulb having consciousness and looking up and witnessing the season as it progresses, the winter season as it progresses, waiting and waiting and waiting for the sun to come out so it can blossom and produce leaves again. All right, so that's what we mean by a nature persona poem. So let's get ready to write. We have, let's see, about 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. All right, what I'd like you to do is begin by making a list of the animals, plants, insects, rocks, minerals, streams, rivers, and other natural non-humans near you at this very moment. Most of us will be in an office environment. But for example, if through the window you see a tree, you see a stream or river, you see a rock formation, write that down. But you can also write down whatever's in your immediate environment, banana, walnuts, right, house plant. Okay, take a few minutes just to write down everything that is in your vicinity, every non-human that's in your vicinity. Okay, so you might have a list of about half a dozen. What I'd like you to do now is pick one non-human from your list. Okay, pick one non-human from your list. Okay, so you should have picked one non-human from your list. All right, and that is now going to be the non-human that you personify in your poem. We won't do that part. Okay, what we're going to do is apply the five senses to this non-human, all right, that you've selected. And generally speaking, the more sensory input you can have in your poem, the more powerful the poem will be. The more sense of sight, sense of hearing, but also smelling, tasting, feeling, especially when it comes to plant life, which is very multisensory, right? So the more sensory data you can have in your poem, the more it will be a powerful poem. Let's begin with the sense of sight. Now, just for some background, sight tends to be regarded as the most complex and highly developed and important sense for human beings. It's very much linked to the acquisition of knowledge, right? So perception and cognition often are connected to our sense of sight, how we acquire knowledge. Even the act of reading, that's not Braille, but the act of visually reading a text is an example of how we give prominence to sight as a mechanism of knowledge acquisition. Okay, so sight is also connected to science. When we think of how science classifies different species, it's visual usually, right? So, what's the shape of the flower? What's the shape of the stem and the leaves? It's called taxonomy, and that's how we create species names, or that's how we know, for example, that a banyan is a ficus genus, and then has a species names by virtue of visual classification through the scientific method. So that's to say that sight is certainly in the Western tradition is very much connected to enlightenment and to the acquisition of wisdom and knowledge. So what I'd like you to do is for 3 minutes, and I'll time us, I'd like you to write everything that your non-human sees. What does your non-human see? Does your non-human see you? What do you look like as your non-human is perceiving you? What does the world look like to your non-human as your non-human perceives the world? Okay. What does your non-human see? Write down anything that comes to mind for the next 3 minutes, and I'll let you know when that 3 minutes is up. So that's the first step, writing down everything that comes to mind insofar as what does your non-human see? How does your non-human see the world? The next step has to do with hearing, the sense of hearing or audition. Sound is a series of pressure waves, and sound waves are made by objects that are vibrating. The vibrating object pushes on the air around it. So sound is a vibration, and there are three main qualities of sound. There's the volume, loud or quiet. There's the pitch, high or low, and there's the timbre, or the texture or character, right? So the volume, the pitch, and the timbre. Galileo said that sounds are made and heard by us when the air is ruffled and moves certain cartilages. So sound involves the perception of vibration. Okay, sound is vibration. There are studies that show that plants can hear. Plants have the ability to hear. Plants are using a sound to identify water sources, to identify caterpillars and other predators. Okay, and that plants that need water or that have had their stems cut produce a certain sound pattern. And this sound pattern has been likened to a cry. Let's see if this audio, that may not work, but there are recordings of the cries of tomatoes that have not been watered properly. Sound is much more of an urgent sound, an urgent clicking sound. So bear that in mind that not only can mammals hear, but plants can hear as well. All right. So what I'd like you to write now, this is the second step. What does your non-human hear? Okay. Once again, try to empathize, try to occupy the position of your non-human and write down everything that comes to mind. What does your non-human hear? That was our second step. What does your non-human hear? The next one is what does your non-human smell? Smell in humans and in other mammals is closely connected to memory and emotion. It actually occupies a part of the brain that's very ancient, called the limbic system. And some writers like Proust were exceptionally gifted in expressing the nuances of smell in their writing, which is very, very difficult thing to do, in fact. Anosmia is the loss of smell, but in fact, some people and also some animals, right, wolves and bears, have an exceptionally acute sense of smell. So I'd like you to now address the third question. What does your non-human smell? Not what does your non-human smell like, but what does your non-human smell, right? What are some of the fragrances that your non-human perceives? Right? What is the world like for your non-human in terms of smell? Take a few minutes for that. Okay, so we had what does your non-human see? What does your non-human hear? What does your non-human smell? And I think you might be able to guess the fourth step. What does your non-human taste? Each step becomes more difficult, right? Each step becomes a little more complex. What does your non-human taste? Sense of taste is often called gustation. And there are 5 basic tastes. There's sweet, sour, salty, bitter, but there's also umami. Umami is like savory, comes from Japanese philosophy of taste. There's also the idea of taste as an expression of preferences, the ability to discern between qualities. So I have good taste in fashion, I have good taste in friends, right? So there's this discerning quality as well, that's connoted in the word taste. Taste, like smell, is known to be challenging to convey through words. Some writers do better than others. Nabhan does very well describing the taste of corn, the mouth-watering texture of a steam roasted mass of creamy corn kernels, right? Get some of the taste sensation in there in the language. And as we learned during the pandemic, there are conditions where people lose their sense of taste or have reduced gustatory sense. So taste, very complex, very connected to emotion and memory, much like smell. So the fourth step, what does your non-human taste? Not what does your non-human taste like, but what does your non-human taste? Okay, take a minute or two for that. Okay, what does your non-human taste? We know in reality our sensory experiences tend to intertwine, but there's good value, especially as we are writing, there's good value in focusing on one of the senses, making sure that it's fully represented, um, examining it closely, right? So there's value in kind of separating senses sometimes as we write about them. Now, the last step, but not the least step, uh, is the sense of touch. The sense of touch. There's a whole vocabulary for touch. As writers know, there's hard, soft, smooth, slick, tickling, and all variations in between of tactile language. It's also the idea of being touched, of being moved, being affected, being impacted positively. So there was a touching novel, a touching moment, a touching play. We were moved somehow. So that's another connotation of the word touch. And Margaret Atwood, the novelist, wrote that touch comes before sight, before speech. It is the first language and the last, and it always tells the truth. Okay. There's all kinds of terminologies for the loss of touch, for reduced sensation, and conversely for enhanced touch or highly sensitive perception. Okay, so the fifth and final step to this writing activity is, what does your non-human feel? How does your non-human move, right? Oops. So what does your non-human feel? What does it touch around it? If that tree outside is touching um, another tree, it's having that experience. As the wind moves, it pushes the leaves together, they come into contact, there's an experience of touch, right? So what does your non-human feel in its world? Touch also connects to movement, kinesthesia. So you could also respond to that question. How does your non-human move? Let's take a minute or two for that. So now you have some phrases or ideas or words written down for each of the five senses. And I'd like you just to take a few minutes and work on drafting what you've written into the beginnings of a poem. So experiment first off with maybe rewriting some key phrases. You can even highlight some of the phrases that stand out in the list that you've written in terms of sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. So selecting some phrases that have striking images or are especially compelling, and then reworking the material for clarity, and then beginning to shape the material into a poem that's rhymed or unrhymed, that has stanza formations, right? Not that I want you to complete the poem now, but I just like you to look at what you've written and begin to think how you would shape it into a poem that has a progression, that has clear line structures, clear stanza structures, and that really represents the non-human as a persona. Remember, each poem is a nature persona poem. So the non-human you selected is speaking about its experiences of life through your poem. Just take a minute and reflect on what you've written so far. Okay, so you have the beginnings of a persona poem. And for those of us who teach literature or who teach creative writing to university students, but all levels of students and adults, um, this can be a very interesting activity. So getting your students to think carefully about the five senses and then to try to adopt the speaking position of a non-human being, whatever that is, a plant, an animal, a rock, a tree, a river, a lake. Right? So it's an eco-critical writing activity insofar as it gets us to uh, forego our typical normative human speaking position that's describing the world around us and to practice deep empathy by attempting to adopt the speaking position of the non-human. So very good activity. And also you can take it one step further and you can get your students to perform the poems that they've written. So they're speaking on behalf of the tree or the lake or the animal through their poem. So they have to dramatize their poem. So it introduces an element of performance and drama. Okay, that's all for me. All I wanted to share with you. I believe we now have some time for questions, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I'll also have a look at the chat to see uh, some of your responses. So thank you very much. I'll turn over the session to our kind moderator. Thank you for the opportunity to share that material with you this morning.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ryan, for such an insightful and inspiring presentation. I think it's truly impressive that you've learned so much about Indonesian ecology. And I think it's also interesting the way you guided us through the creative process of drafting a poem from a non-human perspective. It was a truly unique and memorable learning experience that allowed us to connect theory with the creativity. Okay, so everyone, we will now open the floor for a discussion and Q&A session. If any of our participants have questions or comments, maybe, please feel free to click the raise hand button, or you can also write them in the chat box. Okay, we have a question, Dr. Ryan, from Muhammad Zakwan. Yes, you may open your microphone, Zakwan.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. I am Muhammad Zakwan Sakirasando from Universitas Negeri Semarang, English Literature Program. And my question to Dr. Ryan would be, why humans exploiting the environment is so bad when anything they do by default would exploit the environment? And if it's bad, because we're doing it too much. How do we determine when environmental exploitation becomes too much? And is it really a bad thing that we're doing it? Thank you very much before.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for the question. A philosophical one for sure. And I think that one of the problems, say, of sustainability discourse and environmental discourse generally is this idea that humans shouldn't impact the environment, right? So humans, by virtue of living, have always impacted the environment, whether it's clearing areas for agriculture or uh, collecting wild crops, hunting, right? Breathing air. By virtue of waking up in the morning, we're impacting our environment. But I think it's a question of reciprocity, right? So in impacting our environment, there's often no giving back. So there's a sense of taking. There's a great deep entitlement to taking. If we look at the rare earths discourse right now, rare earths being those essential minerals required for computer, radar technology, military equipment, cellular technologies, and so forth. There's this drive, this insatiable hunger for rare earths. And countries like Myanmar, for example, are utterly decimated in parts of Myanmar. The landscape's been utterly decimated by this push for rare earths, this insatiable longing. So, what's missing in that question is reciprocity and a sense for sustainable impact, taking enough without taking all. Also, taking and factoring in giving back, right? So, I think the giving back needs to be part of the equation. Let's say if there are monocultural, let's say palm oil, for example, or some other kind of monoculture. Yes, we absolutely need these crops. We need palm oil, we need corn, we need wheat, we need rice, absolutely, to support the human population. But I think ethically, as part of their business plans, the multinational corporations that control, let's say, palm oil or rare earths or whatever it may be, they also need to give back. What does that mean? Restoring species in the areas that they're impacting, ensuring that there is a realistic ecological restoration plan at work that actually includes scientists working on the ground, not just the companies making things up. Also, giving back to the local community, human communities that are impacted by whatever it may be, rare earth mining, palm oil monocultures, rice production, or whatever it is. So there needs to be a greater integration. Our impacts will always be there, but it's a matter of degrees. It's a matter of reciprocity. The reciprocity is missing. There's an assumption still that resources are infinite, right? That oil, for example, will always be available when we know it's a finite resource. That the earth will always be able to support the production of a crop, or will always be able to yield rare earths if we just look closer and we have more technology. But that's not the reality. So there needs to be a sense of reciprocity, B, a sense of long-term stewardship, much like, say, in the Native American tradition of thinking 7 generations ahead. So long-term stewardship, reciprocity, and just a sense that humans are not the only ones occupying the earth, right? So that would be my response. It's certainly an important question, and thank you for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Zakwan, for the question. Next one, I think we have a question, and it is written in the chat box. It's from Amsterdam. I can't help but be reminded of pastoral poems that I learned in class. Would the concept of pastoral poems and environmental poems be interchangeable in their practice, or is there a difference between them?
Mhm. Yes, there are slight differences. The pastoral tradition of poetry, let's think of, for example, poems by Wordsworth in the Romantic tradition. They were largely disconnected from any kind of environmental urgencies for various reasons. First of all, there's a kind of aesthetics at work in the pastoral tradition of celebrating the landscape as this picturesque idol in a way, uh, and also privileging the human as this being having a transcendent experience. So when Wordsworth peers over that prospect, there's a kind of awakening, an inner awakening that occurs that's connected to the beauty of that prospect, to that the perfection of that view. So that's the kind of tradition that the pastoral poem inhabits. The environmental poem is probably more a product of the post 1970s environmental movement, where much environmental poetry of the last, like, say, 5 decades has started to integrate environmental urgencies. So rather than that view having this spiritual impact on the poet, there's perhaps this idea of the view as being an industrialized one, as being a fractured landscape. There's even been some theorizations of the ideas of the post-pastoral, the poisoned pastoral is another term I've seen, and there are several others, but the post-pastoral poem as one that's careful of its conventions so that it's not reinscribing this kind of romantic view of the environment as unimpacted, but really of the environment as one that's in constant flux in an industrialized landscape, post-industrialized landscape, one where, okay, the river is beautiful in that valley, but as we get closer, we see the river is poisoned, the fish are dying, right, and all of this sort of these environmental realities. Those environmental realities are central to what I would call environmental poetry or eco poetry, whereas they're not necessarily essential to pastoral poetry, which celebrates human spiritual uh, spiritual experience through a landscape. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your response, Dr. Ryan. Do we have any more questions from? Okay, we have more questions. This one is from Pak Rifka Pratama. So environmental issues and threats have been occurring on a massive scale. How can eco-criticism through poems or poetry meaningfully help the world address these challenges, Doctor?
Yes, an interesting question. And I think there was a book maybe 20 years ago written called How Poetry Can Save the Earth, is the title of it. And it's, I think of it more as a rhetorical question because it's still open for debate, right? You could say, well, to address an environmental crisis, we should use engineering. We should engage scientists. We should use restoration biology and lots of other technical approaches. But there's still value in what the humanities offers and what poetry offers in particular in terms of transforming perceptions. And this can often happen on a small scale and on a local level. Let's say if you're working in an an educational context with children, let's say, and you introduce poetry that has an environmental theme. You take them through some poetry exercises that allow them to engage with the natural world outside of them. It's quite a great pedagogical strategy for enhancing environmental awareness. Environmental awareness then carries through the generations. In Bhutan, where I'm currently teaching, there is a strong environmental ethic that is inculcated in youth early on, and it's part of the gross national happiness, they call it, gross national happiness framework of Bhutan, where environmental sustainability is very closely connected to well-being and happiness and success, societal success. So uh, for those students, the idea of sustainability is nothing foreign, and they have already have a kind of natural empathy for the non-human world. So they're more inclined to think of it as something to be protected than exploited. So I think there's value in changing attitudes and perceptions, transforming those perceptions via poetry. Not that we want to impose any kind of environmental ideals or ideologies on people, but I think there's value in allowing people to come to their own realizations about our deep interconnectivities so that they can take that in the direction that they wish, whether it's through um, working in a business on the sustainability side of things, working in a nonprofit, or just gardening, growing some of their own food, or just listening to nature, sitting with a tree and being more contemplative rather than so enwrapped in the pace of many modern societies. So I think where poetry operates is at the end of that side of the spectrum about values, attitudes, psychologies, philosophies, and that's really the basis of a culture, right? We wouldn't have technology and engineering without that substratum. So poetry and other humanistic practices have the ability to vivify that substratum because in rejecting the natural world, we devitalize ourselves, right? So there's deep value in that connectivity on multiple fronts. So that's where I see the power of poetry lying. That's where it is located. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the explanation, Prof. Ryan. We still have some more questions, and the next one is from Pak Hadianto. So, Prof. Ryan, in your opinion, what are the concept, the underlying reason, and the impact of the emergence of post-colonial eco-criticism in literary works, especially poetry? Thank you.
Yeah, so for many decades, post-colonial critique didn't necessarily engage environmental issues, and it was really with Tiffin, the work of Tiffin and Huygens, the book called Post-Colonial Ecocriticism in 2010, and maybe in about like the preceding 5 years, let's say 2005 to about 2010, there was work amongst post-colonial scholars on the environment. And what that work has done is really elucidated the connections between post-colonialism, environment, and literary production, right? That many post-colonial environments are still suffering from the impacts of colonialism. Maybe certain industries were set up during the colonial period that have had these long-term ramifications into the post-colonial era. For example, let's say in places like Papua New Guinea, where Papua New Guinea achieved independence in 1975, but there have been over the last 5 decades lots of environmental disasters connected to colonial structures. So lots of the multinational corporations, the mines, and so forth operate in a very much a colonialist fashion. So what eco-criticism, post-colonial eco-criticism has drawn our attention to is that conjunction between post-colonial urgencies and environmental urgencies, and then how those urgencies are represented or even voiced in literature. I'm thinking for some reason, again, about Papua New Guinea. Many poets of the last 50 years have voiced those concerns about the environment that are necessarily post-colonial or colonial in origin and therefore post-colonial realities. And I think we could say the same about, let's say, Indonesia and Australia, other post-colonial societies, that literature can become a voice for the deep interconnections between colonial legacies and environmental urgencies of the present, like climate change in many places. So some of those colonial structures are still at work, and those underpin some of the environmental injustices and urgencies that we find in the present. That would be the main argument of post-colonial eco-criticism. So I think adding the post-colonial dimension to eco-criticism is very powerful when we're looking at the literature of countries like Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, India, Australia, New Zealand, and many, many other countries. African literature, post-colonial criticism is very, very, very important as a lens for understanding how authors have grappled with environmental issues in their country. And sometimes literature has been the only outlet for authors who have been persecuted in those countries for their environmental activism. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you. So moving on from post-colonial eco-criticism, we have the next question is about modernization. So can we say that eco-criticism always challenges the modernization, as some literary works in Romanticism challenge the modernization or capitalism in 19th century?
Yes, that's another good question. And I think that early eco-criticism really gave weight to those authors and literary works that challenged capitalism, modernization, and globalization. Let's look, for example, at Henry David Thoreau. So Henry David Thoreau was known for living in a simple cabin for a little over a year. But for the rest of his life, he had a very simple lifestyle. He was very much a local writer during the last years of his life in particular. He didn't travel far from Concord, Massachusetts. So he became the epitome for early eco-critics of a writer who eschewed some of those capitalistic values. And I think that's true of other early eco-criticism. I would say that in the past decades, eco-criticism has diversified to include not necessarily only critiques of capitalism and modernism and globalization, but to look for environmental sustainability that works economically, environmentally, socially, and culturally, so that it's not simply a matter of rejecting capitalism and embracing, let's say, Marxism, for example, but it's a matter of creating a sustainable environment. And sustainability in itself is a kind of buzzword with a discourse of its own, and it's not entirely clear, what it means in certain contexts. But I think eco-criticism has diversified to the point where it's accepted multiple ways of existing in the world. So there's this idea from Ursula Heise called eco-cosmopolitanism. Eco-cosmopolitanism. This is the idea that because we live on a planet and our world has become increasingly globalized, and the internet is, of course, a good example of how now global connectivity is just the norm. We can talk to people across the world in an instant. We can send data to those people, in under a second. It's remarkable. So she advocates this idea of eco-cosmopolitanism, which embraces the global, not as globalization, but as the global. So that eco-criticism doesn't need to be totally allied with the regional, with the local, with the anti-capitalist, but it can embrace a global sense for community and nature. This makes sense insofar as our impacts do have this global effect now, our environmental impacts and the way information travels as well. It's just the last 20 years have been really, really transformative. So I would say that to answer your question succinctly, it would be that early eco-criticism really aligned itself with those values of the local, the anti-capitalist, the regional, and so forth. But I think there's been a broadening theoretically of eco-criticism to embrace other ways of being that may connect with some forms of capitalism, but that seek sustainability, seek to acknowledge the global nature of our society now, and that they they don't they give value to the regional without privileging the regional over the global. So yeah, that would be my response. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for your response. So moving on, I think the next question is related to the creative process of poetry writing, Dr. Ryan. So this next question is from Bapak Optifairi Chandra. So when environmental objects such as plants, animals, and grass are included in a poem, they represent the way people think about the object based on their cultural perspective. So how does eco-criticism work on it?
Yes, absolutely. So we bring our cultural background to any representation, right? So let's say I'm writing about grass. Maybe um, the way that I would write about grass is very different to the way an indigenous person in Australia would write about grass, which is very different to the way that someone from another cultural background would write about grass. Similarly, how I would write about grass would be different to how someone who um, farms would write about grass, or someone who is involved in, let's say, the golfing industry would write about grass, where grass is very much about turf, and grass needs to look perfect and for as a commodity, right? So we bring those values to our writing. Absolutely. I think that, let's say, with this exercise of the nature persona poem, it's about trying to go beyond the particular values that we have, whether they're good or bad or neutral, trying to go beyond them by embracing the subject position of the grass itself, right? That it can have its own view of the world, that it can have its own experiences, regardless of how we construct it culturally, right? So I could see a tree outside and think of it as a commodity. Well, that tree is only good because it's providing shade. Um, oh, it's starting to, looks like it's starting, some of the limbs are falling off. Let's cut it down. It's not serving its purpose anymore. Let's say I have a very utilitarian view of that tree. But if I learn to think with that tree as an entity with its own perspective, maybe I'll be more empathetic and compassionate towards the tree as it changes through the season, as it loses its limbs, as it maybe cannot perform its utilitarian function. So I think the value in experimenting with that subject position is transcending the preconceived notions that we may have about the non-human object. Yet there's the other side of this I want to mention, and that is embracing the positive values that we may have that come from our culture. If our cultures teach us to see that tree as an animate being, if our cultures teach us to respect the tree, like in, for example, in many Indian culture, Indian uh, tribal cultures of India, there is a deep connection to trees because they're part of kin. They're part of the kin network of certain communities. So when those trees are cut, people will perform ceremonies and ask permission of the tree and confer respect to the tree. So those sorts of values, I think, can be amplified in poetry because as generations change, the values are under or imperiled in a way because generations may be adopting more urban values, more globalist commercial values, right? So they may be losing some of those traditional views. So I think one of the strengths of poetry and other literary forms is to provide a record, provide a medium for those values to be passed on to for future generations, but also readers around the world who can then embrace those values and implement them in practical ways in their own communities. Thank you.
Okay, so we have one more question. This one is from our participant. So what responsibilities do poets and critics share, in your opinion, in cultivating what you've called a botanical consciousness within the environmental humanities?
Yes, poets and critics are essential for that environmental consciousness or that botanical consciousness, right? Um, Part of that consciousness is literally recognizing consciousness in the environment. And this is a radical shift in Western epistemology, right? We tend not to think of the world around us as having consciousness. The environment is not a bearer of consciousness. Plants are not bearers of consciousness in this strict Western kind of epistemology that would say that only beings with brains and nervous systems like humans and mammals and maybe some amphibians have a capacity for consciousness. So, in developing our consciousness as awareness, we need to recognize the inherent consciousness of the plant, of the animal, of the environment, of the river. Now, this may sound speculative, but it's been shown that, for example, that plants have, it's been shown by science, not that science needs to validate everything, but it's interesting to consider that science has shown plants to be bearers of memory. Also, that plants have a kind of consciousness or intelligence that involves making decisions, that involves communicating, that involves actually forms of altruism. So the plant will send information when it's being attacked, for example, by a predator. The plant may send information to other plants to warn them, not necessarily to preserve itself, but just as an act of altruism to let them know to buffer up their own system so they can defend against this attack. So there's all of these complex mechanisms at work within plant life and presumably amongst fungi. And I'm sure in the future we'll show that rocks are not merely inanimate, but spiritual traditions have shown this for centuries and millennia. But science needs to catch up. Science is basically like the immature child that's catching up with the wisdom of indigenous traditions. And so ecocriticism and poetry, what they do is they can amplify this deeper sense of nature, right? So when you switch the perspective of the poem from that of the poet observing the world to the poet being observed by the world, right? The poet observing the tree, much like some of those Joyce Kilmer and those famous romantic poems about trees do. They observe the beauty of the tree. But when the tables are turned and the tree is observing us back through the poem, that represents a simple but powerful shift of consciousness that recognizes the consciousness of the non human. In order for our own consciousness to evolve, we need to recognize the consciousness of that which we regard as nature, environment, or other, right? The nature out there, or as inanimate, right? And so that's where I think poetry and environmental criticism are essential because they uphold those values that we need to really forge a new relationship to nature beyond what we've had in the past centuries, let's say since the Industrial Revolution, which has been a very, very exploitative one and a very, simply put, a very disrespectful one. When we are receiving all that we require to live, oxygen, food, water, and generally speaking, when there's very little respect conferred back to those that have provided us all that we need to live. It's a desperate situation that needs to change. And so that's where poetry and criticism become really, really essential.
Okay. Thank you very much for answering all questions very clearly, Dr. Ryan. Unfortunately, because we have limited time, we have to bring this session to a close. So from Dr. Ryan's presentation, I think we have learned that eco-criticism invites us to explore literature through an environmental lens to see how texts reflect, represent, or reshape human relationships with the natural world. And the discussion showed that language is not only a tool for expression, but also a bridge that connects humans with nature. Okay, so before we conclude, I would like to once again express our sincere gratitude to Dr. John Charles Ryan for sharing his time, experience, and knowledge with us today. Thank you very much. And thank you also to everyone who participated so attentively in today's lecture. And let us carry today's insights forward, not only in our studies, but also in how we appreciate and care for the environment around us. Okay, so now I'd like to hand the session back to our MC. Over to you, Adin.
Yeah, so thank you, Ma'am Tias. And also, I would like to thank to our speaker for the insightful session. And now we would like to invite the head of the English Literature Study Program, Dr. Andes Oktiva Heri Chandra M. Hum, to deliver the closing remarks. Dr. Oktiva, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Adi. What an inspiring session we have just had. And then on behalf of everyone here, I would like to thank Dr. John Charles Ryan for sharing his time, idea, and passion with us today. His insight on eco-criticism, nature, and poetry really gave us a new way to think about how literature connects to the world we live in, especially in the natural world that often goes unnoticed in our busy life. It's amazing how poetry can make us see nature not just as a backdrop, but as something alive, speaking and deeply intertwined with who we are. I'm sure many of us are walking away from this talk, feeling more aware, more inspired, and maybe even a little more responsible toward our environment. And of course, in this session, I would like to thank you to all of you for being here, listening and engaging with today's discussions. Let's keep this idea alive. Keep reading, keep writing, keep thinking about how we can bridge our language and the living world around us. I would also like to give a big shout out to the organizing committee and everyone who worked behind the scene to make this event happen smoothly. Thank you for your time, effort, and dedication. Thank you, everyone. And let's give one more round of applause for Dr. Jens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thanks so much to the organizing committee. Very much a pleasure to speak with you all about this topic. Love to see your interest in this and your enthusiasm for the study of environment. So a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Yes, we're blessed to have you today. So, Dr. Ryan.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's visiting professor on eco-criticism, nature, and poetry. On behalf of the English Literature Study Program, Universitas Diponegoro, we would like to express our deepest gratitude for your presence and participation. We look forward to seeing you again at our future events. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much once again, Dr. Ryan, and then see you next or another webinar or seminar in the future. I mean,
I look forward to that. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you all. Hope to see you again in person next time. That would be great. Okay.
oh yes.